So what I did with these charts here, this new bar type, is let me show you like this. I had Blackbird on a 30-second chart. The problem with those 30-second charts, sometimes, and especially out, around news announcements and very fast-moving sections of market, we could get to the point where we had, a massive reversal bar, and by the time we would get into the trade, it might be 20 or 25 ticks away from the area, and then our stop would have to be so big. And then, other times, especially in the overnight, there might be a couple of periods, a couple of 30-second periods back to back where you didn't even have a trade, or maybe you only had one trade. So you'd be potentially missing data, or just have maybe one tick for that time period. And it just made for a pretty ugly chart with a lot of random volume signals. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to design a bar. I've been thinking about this for years, but I finally got to the point to where I was so fed up with what I was dealing with that I just went ahead and designed it. Essentially what it is, it's a hybrid between range, tick, and seconds. And I did that because, number one, I wanted to have a minimum range for each bar. So in this case, this is a minimum range of 1. Well, I've added in both minimums and maximums for range, tick, and second. So what does that mean? That means that we have 3 minimums, a minimum for the range, a minimum for the ticks, and a minimum for the seconds. And then we have maximums for each of those. So min and max range, min and max number of ticks, min and max number of seconds. And you don't necessarily have to use the maximums, but if you do want to, you just set the last number of each property to the multiple of the min that you want to use as the max. I know this is incredibly complicated, but you'll see the difference between the charts here in a moment and see why this has actually been a pretty incredible breakthrough for us. In this case, it's the last number of each set that provides the maximum multiple. So this would be a 1 range minimum with a 8 times 1 and 8 range maximum, a 250 tick minimum with an 8 times 250, 2000 maximum, and a 30-second minimum with a 30 times 5, 2.5 minute maximum. So if any maximum is met, it will instantly open a new bar. Okay? Otherwise, all 3 minimums must be met before it opens a new bar. So I did that specifically for the volume and the confirmation signals, the divergence in the volume, because let me just show you a little bit right here. This is what I'm after here. You see this little section of market? In this case, this is sort of the overnight. We're starting to get into the morning here. In this little section, it's acting more like a tick chart than it is a second chart. It'll start to act more like a 30-second chart. In this case, this is a minute and a half. It's more like well, it's 90 seconds, but it has a maximum of 450 seconds. So a minute and a half minimum with a 7.5 minute maximum and a 2 range minimum. So no bar will ever be less than a 2 range. So essentially what this does, what it helps with, is isolating those climactic moves, those really fast moves into an area, either up or down, into a high, hitting resistance, and then seeing that resistance very clearly come in. For example, just right here, I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? You've got a big buying climax here, followed by a narrow range, high volume churn bar. You've got a churn bar right there, which knocks it sideways for a while. You've got the same thing going on here. You've got a climax followed by a churn and another wide-ranging high volume bar with very high density closing off of the highs. And it's a pretty strong sign of hitting resistance, supply coming in. It's also a volume divergence, which is all automated now, obviously. So I wanted a chart that would really work to confirm our areas in the market geometry much more effectively and really let me look into, what's happening with the volume on a bar by bar basis, but be able, really be able to control that bar as thoroughly as possible. Not only with a minimum range, but also with a maximum range, such that if I do get a reversal bar, if it hits the area and then starts moving back up, the bar will never be over 16 ticks. In this case, on the trade chart, it'll never be over 8 ticks. So this is a 1-minute chart of ZB, and you can see there are several 1-minute periods in the overnight that don't even get a trade. Or maybe you just get 1 tick. So the ZB intraday is really pretty ugly. And I don't like having to use, only a tick chart. I want to use both minute and tick. But for something like the ZB, really any market that has, not a lot of movement in the overnight, really not a lot of movement in general, but especially not in the overnight, I wanted to really clean this thing up. And that's what this bar type does. It cleans it up, but still allows for really identifying those climactic moves. So it's not like a range chart where every bar is going to be the same exact range, and then you can't look at wide ranging or narrow ranging bars. You can't get as good of a feel of price action. And then with tick charts, you don't have really strong identification of climactic moves either, because they'll be spread out over a couple of few bars, whereas on a minute chart, it would just be one really strong fast move within 1 or 2 bars. That same climax on a tick chart, relatively sized, would be spread out over a number of bars. So with this, we still retain those wide variance possibilities in the range from one bar to the next, so we can still see those climaxes very well, and also the narrow range churn bars. So this really is the best bar type that we could possibly make for these confirmation type signals. So this is the ES 30 second. You can see how sparse that is in the overnight. And then this is the ES 1 range 500 tick 30 second. So a lot nicer, right? And we can still see those wide ranging bars and narrow ranging bars. Let me see if I have any of these with volume already on them. This is well, let me show you the 5-minute chart first. Okay, there's the 5-minute with the overnight. A lot of nasty mess in here in the overnight. You do have see, these last couple of bars don't really show the climax there. It shows up very well right here, that 2-bar pattern there, big buying climax followed by a narrow range, really high volume per range churn bar there. And then the same kind of a thing going on here, selling climax followed by a churn bar. But you look at all of this on a tick chart, a similarly sized tick chart like we have right here, and you don't see any of that. You see a few churn bars here back to back, but really the tick chart is mostly for looking at volume per tick to identify how many contracts per tick are coming in, to try and identify those whales coming in, the guys trading the large number of contracts per trade. While I would say it is useful information, volume per tick, it's still not, but it's like anything else. It works in certain situations. But here, that buying climax, you see you've got a little climax here. But you see what I mean with the tick chart? It takes up a few bars here and a few bars here. Whereas on the 5-minute, it's just a couple of bars, or even right here, it's just really 2 bars. But with this new bar, the volume signals are a lot more obvious. They really stand out. Look at this. I mean, you've got a huge extreme churn bar there. Very high volume. It's a huge volume divergence. And you see what I mean? You see how it smooths out those bars that are kind of following the tick settings more than the second settings. So it's more governed by the range and the tick. And then when you get that really high volume move, then it starts to move more like a time-based chart, which is really what you want to identify these specific signals. So that's why I've developed this bar type. And it's really key for what we're doing.